This is a solution to problem number 51 from homework 6.4 day 3. We're asked to graph a cosine function with quite a few transformations. I'm going to rewrite this as 2/3 cosine. Then I'm going to factor out the b value, which when I have x over 2 is actually 1/2. That's the value of b. When I factor out 1/2, I'm left with x minus pi over 2. And I can tell that it's pi over 2 because if I distributed 1/2 back to pi over 2, I would get pi over 4. Okay, so let's do the analysis. The first thing we want to find out is the axis of oscillation. So the axis of oscillation is determined by vertical shifts here. We don't have any vertical shifts here, so the axis of oscillation is going to be at y equals 0. So I'm going to go ahead and put that axis of oscillation at y equals 0 on my graph. Y equals 0 is the axis of oscillation. Next thing we want to know is what's the amplitude. So the amplitude is determined by the coefficient of that multiplies cosine. So that is 2/3. So the amplitude is 2/3. That means our graph is going to go up 2/3 of a unit and down 2/3 of a unit from the axis of oscillation. So I'm going to set my x scale, my y scale. I'm going to use 3 of these red lines as 1 unit. So that's going to be 1 here, and I'm going to go down 3 red lines. That's going to be -1. And then I'm going to put in a dashed line for the maximum, which is at y equals 2/3, and 1 for the minimum, which is going to be at y equals -2/3. And that's the envelope in which the cosine graph is going to oscillate up and down. The next thing we want to determine is the period. So the period for a cosine function is 2 pi over b, where b is the coefficient of x. In this case, b is 1/2, so I have 2 pi divided by 1/2, which is 2 pi over 1 times 2 over 1, which is 4 pi. So one cycle is going to take 4 pi units. And for our graph, what we really want to know is the interval for the key points. So key points are going to occur every 1/4 period. So that's going to be 1/4 times 4 pi, which is going to be every pi units. So a nice scale for the x-axis is going to be to count by units of pi. So I could go ahead and I can put on the x scale right now. So we're going to count by units of pi. I'm going to let 2 squares here be pi. So this will be pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, and then -pi, -2 pi, -3 pi, -4 pi. And then the next thing we need to figure out is the starting point. So the starting point, to do that, I'm going to pick an easy point on the graph of cosine to transform. So an easy point on cosine x is the maximum, 0, 0, 1. And then let's see what happens to our x values and our y values. So x values are going to be multiplied by 2, because that 1/2 means we have actually a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2. So I have 0, 1 is just going to stay 0, 1, because 0 times 2 is 2. The other thing that's happening to our x values is I have this x minus pi over 2. That means the graph is shifted right pi over 2, which means I add pi over 2 to all my x values. So this point now becomes pi over 2, 1. And then let's see what's happening to y values. Y values from this 2/3 are multiplied by 2/3. So pi over 2, 1 is going to become pi over 2, 2/3. And that's our starting point. Since this is a cosine graph, we're either going to start at a maximum or minimum. We don't have to worry about which direction it goes. Like for the sine function, if it starts at a maximum, it has to go down. If it starts at a minimum, it's going to go up as we move to the right. So let's start plotting these points. So we've got pi over 2, 2/3. So that's right here. And then every pi units, we're going to have another key point. Remember, pi units is 2 lines on this graph, the scale that I set up. So I'm going to be here at 3 pi over 2, 0, And then the next one is going to be at 5 pi over 2 negative 2/3. And I'm going to continue on every 2 units on the x scale, oscillating between the midline, the maximum, back to the midline, then to the minimum. So I'm going to continue to plot points so that we can sketch this graph. Okay, that's sufficient. We have a couple cycles here. And that's our graph.